Well, hello again, everyone. I would say that it is great to be with you fine folks at Independent Pres once again, though in this endless year 2020, being with you is not exactly the kind of being with you that I really wish I could do. I know that we keep hoping that this long, terrible pandemic will finally come to an end. It has certainly taken a toll upon both the life of our nation, the lives of individual people in our nation and around the world. And it's also taken a toll upon our souls as we've had to adjust to new and distant realities. There's nothing I'd like better than to be with all of you during this holiday season. It's been quite the year, and I know that we're ready for it to all be past us. There does seem like there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and so we certainly are praying blessings upon all of those people who are working so hard to get our lives back to normal. Well, I have been asked if I would do another lesson this year to kick off the Advent season, and I was only too happy to be able to do that. I love this season. I was just sitting in our glider over here next to our Christmas tree recently, and my younger son Elijah was across the way, and as I just sort of wistfully looked up at our Christmas tree, I just said, I love Christmas. It really is a wonderful time, and I hope that yours will be one that is full of family and enjoying this wonderful season of the year. Well, our topic today is going to be the three wise men. I confess that as a little boy, there were few stories in the Bible that captured my attention the way that the story of the three wise men did. We Three Kings was always one of my favorite Christmas carols, and I just thought the whole story was a fun story. Now, I'm going to default to saying the three wise men repeatedly, I'm sure, during this lesson today, but of course, we don't actually know whether there were three. Church tradition gives us the names of them, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But we don't know that there were three, but that will not stop me. I am going to press on again with our We Three Kings as we talk about this story. The story, to be honest, is one that has a bit of mystery about it. It's quite simple to imagine the shepherds who were there in their fields, and the angels appear to them, and they go and find baby Jesus and the Holy Family. The wise men, they are a somewhat more interesting and complex story, I think. When I was a kid, I don't feel like I understood the story at all, except to be fascinated by it. I feel like I've learned a bit more about it now. And of all places, the place where I learned the most about it was in my grad school experience of studying a language that's called Akkadian. Akkadian, what in the world is that? Well, I'll try to explain some as I go along. The study of the wise men is first and foremost a study in contrast. What I want to do today is I want to contrast three kings with one king and then the king. So let's start with the three kings. The story of the three wise men begins in Matthew chapter 2. There we read, in the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, Magi from the east came to Jerusalem, asking, where is the child who has been born King of the Jews? For we observed his star at its rising, and have come to pay him homage. Well, what is a Magi? And what is all this about the east? And certainly, what is all this business about the star? What is that about? Well, let's start by talking about the Magi. And first, the right question is not what is a Magi, but what are Magi? The word Magi is the plural form of the word Magus. Now, this is a term you might know from the character Simon Magus. He's the person that's mentioned in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 8, and he actually became this figure of myth and legend as a magician, and that's the key connection. The Greek word is magoi. This is the plural of the word magos. This is the term from which we get our modern word magic. Now, today, when we think of magicians, we think of them as people like David Copperfield or Penn and Teller, who can do these sleight of hand sort of tricks. You always see them on America's Got Talent, those kinds of characters. Traditionally, though, magicians, they were thought to be able to do these sorts of things because they possessed secret knowledge into how the world and to how the elements worked. In antiquity, It was this possession of secret knowledge. That was the key that lay behind the Magi. Okay, so that's the Magi. Well, what about the East? Well, this is where studying that language called Akkadian proved to be so helpful. Akkadian is actually the technical name for Babylonian and Assyrian, these two dialects together. These are the languages of Mesopotamia. This, and along with places like Persia, is what the East is that Matthew is talking about. Mesopotamian history and literature is just filled with information about magic and about the magoi. Now, of course, they didn't use the Greek term to describe these. They had all sorts of different names for these magicians or priests that were there. There were these entire priestly classes that were devoted to uncovering secret knowledge, to figuring out what was hidden, whether it was about the future or even about the present. If a king wanted to know whether he should go to battle, he would consult the magicians. If he wanted to know what a dream meant, back to the magicians. These are the folks that you'll remember from places like the book of Daniel. You remember when Nebuchadnezzar, he dreamed such dreams that his spirit was troubled and sleep left him. Well, what did he do? The king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. That's when they come in and they stand before the king, and, well, unfortunately in that situation, they're not able to interpret the dream. Well, what sort of signs did these magicians look for when they were trying to get their insight into secret knowledge? They actually had a wide array of different techniques that they would use to try to uncover this secret knowledge. One of them, and I realize all of this will sound quite odd, but one of these ways that they did it was they looked for odd births. There's an entire catalog of texts. It's called the Shuma Izbum. And what Shuma Izbu means is if there is a deformity. And so they would have the people from throughout the land report in whenever there was something like maybe a cow that was born with two heads, or with an extra leg, or with one eye that was not properly formed. They would report all of these things in and catalog them. And then correspondingly, they would figure out what kind of unusual events had happened that day, and they would make connections between the two. So when you found out that a cow had been born with two heads, you knew from your register of Shuma Izbu exactly what that meant. Now, you couldn't always wait around for there to be a malformed birth to happen. So another way you could do it is that you could do extispicy. Now, extispicy is when you sacrifice a sheep and then you examine the entrails of that sheep, and especially the liver of the sheep. They actually have these tablets that are there, and they're in the shapes of livers. And they have written on them over in this part, well, if this is what you find, then it means this. But if there's a lump over here, it means this. And if this is a hard spot, it means that. So extispicy was another way that you could figure these things out. And then, of course, there was astrology, astronomical phenomena. Now, clearly, the specialty of our Magoi here in the book of Matthew was astrology. And the connection with the East here makes perfect sense. From the very earliest periods in Babylonian and Persian history, we have these texts that show that there were learned men, and sometimes even learned women, in these cultures who paid meticulous attention to the movement of celestial bodies, whether it's the sun, the moon, the planets, the stars, all of these. Well, Matthew, of course, doesn't say that there were three wise men, and he doesn't give us the names of the wise men. It's interesting, though, that in later Christian tradition, the names that we have for these wise men are Balthasar, Melchior, and Caspar. These are names that are Babylonian, Aramaic, and Parthian, respectively. These are names that come from the East, and maybe they confirm that Eastern origin for the wise men. Ancient peoples did not have all of the tools at their disposal that we do today, but they were by no means less intelligent than we are today. These Magoi in the East had done such detailed analysis and observation of the movement of the heavenly bodies that Within about 2 centuries before the birth of Christ, they had produced these detailed lunar almanacs, and they could predict all of the lunar and the solar eclipses. They could tell on what dates stars were going to be visible, when there would be conjunctions between stars, when certain stars would be at opposition to one another, when there would be occultations of stars by the moon or planets by the moon. These were very sophisticated kinds of almanacs. Now, of course, the purpose for these, it wasn't really to pursue science, though they were doing a form of science. What they were trying to do was to draw implications from these observations for understanding the world and for understanding that secret knowledge that I mentioned. We have all sorts of examples of these. I'll read you a couple of them. In one letter here it says, "To the king, my lord, from your servant Balassi, good health to the king. The moon has taken an auspicious aspect. It is the beginning of the month." Or here's another one. "To the king, our lord, from your servants, the scribes of Kilizi, good health to the king. We watched the moon. On the 14th day, the moon and the sun saw each other. This means well-being." Now here's one last one. "To the king, my lord, from your servant Akulanu, good health to the king. Presently I am waiting for the occultation of Jupiter by the moon. When Jupiter stands behind the moon, there will be hostility in the land. But now, perhaps the king, my lord, does not trust my observations. Let a eunuch who has sharp eyes observe. There is less than a span left to close. P.S. The eunuch should stand in shadow to observe. The king will soon believe me." Now, isn't that just fantastic? It's so detailed that he's telling the king, look, you can double check this if you want. I just encourage your servant, your eunuch, whom you go to check, he needs to stand in shadow so that he'll be able to see these things properly. These are the magicians who are from the East. Okay, so then what's all this business about the star? Well, granted that the Magi were star experts, well, what exactly was this star that they saw? Now, the suggestions that have been advanced for this, they are numerous and they are diverse. Some suggest that it was just a miraculous object that was placed over Bethlehem. This is possible, but it does seem kind of odd that you would just describe some sort of light, I guess, as being a star. And stars by themselves, they don't actually stand over something. I mean, if you go outside, they rotate around the sky. It just doesn't work. Some have suggested that it was actually Halley's Comet. Well, the problem is Halley's Comet was a little bit too early for this to coincide with the birth of Jesus. And besides, it's not really clear how just a comet that looks like it's slowly making its way across the sky night after night would really do any of the things that Matthew describes. So another suggestion that maybe it was a supernova. There is some evidence from some ancient Chinese records that there was a supernova that was around this time. It was in the constellation Capricorn. There are a couple of problems though. One is that the supernovae, they don't move relative to the other stars. After all, they're just stars that have exploded themselves. And Matthew's star does. And the other thing is that the text doesn't actually say anything about the star being bright in Matthew. It's actually an interesting detail. Well, there's a wonderful scholar of Akkadian literature whose name is Simo Parpola. And Parpola has suggested that what we may be looking at here is a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn. Now, those of you who pay attention to such matters, you may know that right now there is a conjunction between Jupiter and Saturn that's going on. If you look in the western sky soon, right after sunset, you'll notice these two stars. They're sort of, kind of like this. The brighter one is at the bottom, and then there's another one that's a little, maybe about 10 o'clock from it. And slowly over time, they're going to be making their way closer and closer to the horizon as the night passes on. Well, those two stars are really Jupiter, the bright one, and Saturn, the one that's slightly less bright. Although they are a few 100 million miles apart from one another, by the time we get to December 21st, they're going to be so close to one another that we can't tell them apart. Only that if you have wonderful eyesight will you be able to do that. Well, in the year 7 BC, Jupiter and Saturn were in conjunction for 11 straight months, and they were there in the constellation Pisces when this happened. Well, during these 11 months, the planets, they looked like they would come apart and then come back together 3 separate times. This is something that only happens once every 800 years. It happened in 1583, it happened before that in the year 786, and then it happened before that in 7 BC, just a few years before the birth of Christ. It's an exceptionally rare event. It's so rare that the event was noted and recorded on 4 different lunar almanacs in Babylon. Well, why is this important? Well, these Babylonian almanacs, they were private, not public. In other words, these characters weren't copying from one another. 4 different people transcribed these and figured out that this special event was happening. 4 different times it was taking place. Well, it's especially interesting that the almanacs where this occurs are late almanacs. There are actually only 4 cuneiform texts after the birth of Jesus. Here we have a text that occurs just before the birth of Jesus, and it occurs 4 different times. It's really quite impressive. Well, Parpilla, he adduces that there is evidence to show that more than just the rarity of this event is what's at stake. The religious and mythical significance of the stars is really what the issue is. The conjunction of the supreme god, Jupiter, that's Marduk, with the creator god, Saturn, that was the Babylonian god Ea, in the last constellation of the year back then, Pisces, this could easily have been interpreted as the end of an era, the creation of a new sovereign as we move on to the next king. So why would the Babylonian Magi, why would they possibly go west? Well, unbelievably, there is another star that got in on the act, and that was the star, really the planet, Mars. Mars is the star that the Babylonians associated with the Amuru, or the Westerners. And Mars moved into position alongside Jupiter and Saturn in Pisces. This is the real clincher. The language of this star stopping, well, it really just seems like a little bit too much to bear. Surely this is a bit of poetic license on Matthew's part. Those of you who've done any amateur astronomy, you know that this is actually just a regular part of planet watching. When the Earth passes one of the outer planets in its orbit, well, what looks like happens is that the star will actually move backwards in the sky for a time. It's just an illusion. It's not really moving backwards. It's like that feeling like your car is moving when the car next to you at a stoplight is moving. That's what's going on here. Well, the bottom line is this. The Magi went west, not because the star was in the west. Stars don't actually do that. Stars rotate around the sky. What they did was they went west because the stars signified the west. They went to Jerusalem because it was the political center of the west, the Amuru region. They believed that this new and important king had arrived, not because they saw a star sitting on top of a house, but because they were interpreting the movement of those stars. They knew that they had come to the right place because when they arrived, that was when the star's movement, Mars's movement, appeared to stop. So the Magi believe something significant is happening because in their minds, Marduk and Ea, Jupiter and Saturn, are coming together in the constellation Pisces. They think that whatever that significant event is happening in the west because Mars, the star, really the planet, that's connected with the west, gets in on the act and also joins them in Pisces. And they think that they've found the right place, Jerusalem, because the star, Mars, appears to stop just at the moment when they arrive. I think this is a pretty good theory for what Matthew's trying to describe, even though he describes it in a somewhat poetic fashion as the star coming to rest over the house. Well, that's a lot of introduction about the Magi. What exactly did they do once they came west? Well, if you're looking for a new king, one who's just been born, the palace is the place to start. This birth, though, is news to Herod. When they get to the palace in Jerusalem and they ask about the king who's been born, Herod doesn't know what they're talking about. He's troubled, though, and so he calls for the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and he asks them, where is it that the Messiah is supposed to be born? Well, these priests and scribes, they quote to King Herod Micah 5:2. It says there in Micah 5:2, "For this is what the prophet has written, You, Bethlehem in the land of Judah, are by no means least among the rulers of Judah. For out of you will come a ruler who will be the shepherd of my people Israel." So here is this messianic prophecy in the book of Micah. My goodness, a book that was written way back in the 8th century. And here it's this description of a ruler who comes out of Bethlehem, probably originally hearkening back to David, but this also became something that was a kind of expectation for the new David who would come, that new David, the Messiah. So Herod finds out exactly when the signs had appeared to the Magi, and he sends the Magi to Bethlehem. This is what he says. He says, "Go and make a careful search for the child. As soon as you find him, report to me, so that I too may go and worship him." Right. Herod didn't have any intentions on worshiping him, but he was going to try to use the Magi as his agents, at least, to find him. So the Magi, they head out for Bethlehem just a few miles away, and they know they found the right place because that's when the star stops. It's that issue of the Earth's orbit and that apparent retrograde motion of Mars. They are overjoyed, the text says, because they know they've come to the right place. So this is the response of the three kings to the arrival of Jesus. The response of Herod is going to be quite different. So let's think for a moment about our one king. We've seen the three kings, the wise men. Now let's look at the one king, Herod. After the wise men depart, there's an angel who comes and warns Joseph to flee to Egypt. Well, why is it that they have to flee? Well, they flee because Herod is about to try and find and kill the child. Herod had leaned on the Magi for information about this contender for the throne. He tried to get them to report back to him when they found the new baby. Well, the wise men, they were warned by God not to do this, so they slipped out a different way. When Herod realized that he had been outsmarted, he was furious, and so he issued this shocking executive order. He gives orders that all of the boys 2 and under in Bethlehem should be slaughtered. Now, there is a question that arises. If Herod had done such a dastardly deed, wouldn't it be recorded somewhere? Well, the truth is Herod's dastardly deeds were legion. He had killed political opponents all over the land of Israel, and so there's no particular reason why they should mention this one. Besides that, Bethlehem was actually a very small town at this time. There were only about 1,000 residents in the town at this time, and as scholars have sort of worked out the math, they've calculated this would probably mean only about 20 kids who were 2 years old and younger at that time. So that's the only ones who would have been in jeopardy. So the story is famous, not so much for its large size, but because it's included in the birth of Jesus. That's the reason why the story is so famous. Well, we do have a lesson here, though. What we have is a study in contrast between the response of the Magi to the news of this new king, on the one hand, and then on the other hand, the response of Herod to this news. This passage is actually pretty tightly constructed to highlight the difference between these two responses. The Magi, these were men of position, learning, and we learn from their gifts, men of wealth. And yet when they read in the stars that the gods are sending a new king, they rush to the scene. When they see the stars stop in the sky, the text says that they're overjoyed. Even in their nearly complete religious ignorance, they see in the heavens that a new king has arrived. They fall before him, they give homage to him, and they give him these exquisite gifts. You can contrast these learned pagans with the mighty King Herod. Herod, in some ways, he was just a brilliant leader. When the man he supported, Mark Antony, lost to Caesar Augustus, Herod, he was so bold, he had so much chutzpah, that he got onto a ship and he set out and he sailed to where Caesar was and he submitted to him. He swore, "I was loyal to your opponent, and I will be just as loyal to you." Well, Caesar Augustus was so impressed with Herod's chutzpah in this moment that he ended up giving the kingship of Israel to Herod. He says, Herod, you can become king as long as you'll kick out this group of people called the Parthians. And that's what Herod did. Herod was in many ways a remarkable leader. He formed an army and he drove out the Parthians. He solidified control over the country. He was one of, if not the greatest architects and visionaries of the ancient world. He built a pleasure palace called the Herodium in Bethlehem, this circular palace that you can go up into and see Jerusalem from. He built a 3-level winter palace on the cliffs of Masada. He built several palaces in Jericho. He built temples up in a place called Caesarea Philippi. In Jerusalem, he rebuilt Solomon's temple. He actually made it 3 times the size of Solomon's temple. Herod's temple, just the temple proper, the actual building where the holy place and Holy of Holies was twice the size of the current Dome of the Rock, that gold dome structure that you see in Jerusalem today. The platform that Herod built to hold the temple was the largest sacred area in the entire ancient world. No other sacred area in Rome or in Greece or in Babylon could compare with it. There's a stone in this retaining wall. It's just north of the place that we know as the Western Wall, or sometimes called the Wailing Wall. This stone that they moved into place weighed 580 tons. You can still go and see it there today. It's the weight of 2 747s. Herod was a masterful architect. Over on the coast, he built an entire city in honor of Caesar. It's the city that's called Caesarea Maritima. He developed a technique for making underwater concrete. What they did was they brought in 400 shiploads of ash from Pozzolana, Italy, a place that's around Mount Vesuvius. And they used this ash to make these concrete stones that weighed 90 tons apiece. When he built this harbor, it was the largest harbor in the ancient world, bigger than the harbors of Greece and Rome. He furnished the city with an amphitheater, with this enormous hippodrome that seated 10,000 people. He made Roman baths. He made an Augustana temple that was dedicated to Caesar Augustus. Herod even held Olympiads in Caesarea. There are tombstones in other parts of the Greco-Roman world where the athletes had inscribed in their death monuments that they had competed in the games, the Olympics in Caesarea. Herod was even named president in perpetuity of the Olympics, the real Olympics, the ones in Athens, because when they were out of money, he paid for an entire Olympiad out of his own treasury. Now, of course, his own, meaning the money he had confiscated from the Israelites. Herod was a powerful king. He had scribes and priests at his beck and call. He was privy to the best in that day's biblical scholarship. But Herod had a weakness. He was maniacally, fanatically paranoid. Herod killed his favorite wife, Mariamne. He killed several of his sons, and he did this because he thought that they were conspiring to take the throne. And so when Herod heard the news from these magi that a king was to be born, when he received the instruction from the scholars that this Messiah would come from Bethlehem, Herod's response was not to bow down. His response was not to offer gifts. Instead of gifts, he offered a sword. What he did was he commissioned the slaughter of the innocents, this act that would follow him in the pages of history all the way until the present. Rather than rejoice in the coming of the Messiah, Herod chose to create weeping in the town of the Messiah's birth. The Magi brought homage. They brought wealth to this new king. Herod brought subterfuge. Herod brought paranoia. This contrast between the three kings and between the one king is what brings us to the king. We don't know exactly how the wise men knew that they had found the right house, the house where the Christ child was. We do know that when they saw the Christ child, when they saw baby Jesus and his mother, they offered him gifts. They offered those familiar gifts of gold and frankincense and myrrh. It may be that there is some foreshadowing of Jesus' death in the frankincense and myrrh that were offered to him. We do know, in fact, I've discussed with folks at IPC before, that there's certainly symbolism in the Gospel of Luke about the things that foreshadow the death of Jesus way back in the story of the birth of Jesus. We know, for example, that the inn was not really an inn where they were turned away. They were turned away from an upper room in a house. Jesus was treated inhospitably in an upper room at the beginning of his life, and he would be treated inhospitably in an upper room at the end of his life, at the Last Supper. We know that the Holy Family wasn't banished out to some barn, that where they were really sent was downstairs to the place where the animals lived in the house. And so it's there among the animals that when baby Jesus is born, he's wrapped in swaddling clothes and placed in a manger, this manger that would have been there in the house. Well, this manger would almost certainly have been made not of wood, but of stone. You can see the symbolism. Here we have this baby Jesus wrapped in strips of cloth and placed in a hollowed out stone. Just like at the end of his life, he would be wrapped in strips of cloth and placed into a hollowed out stone tomb. And don't miss the significance about where exactly those animals were. You can't keep all of your flocks and herds inside your house, obviously. The animals that you keep there, these are the sacrificial animals. Jesus was born right in the place where those sacrificial animals were kept, there in the house. All of these things in Luke's gospel, they are foreshadowing of what's going to happen at the end of Jesus' life. It wouldn't surprise me if the frankincense and myrrh, these are these aromatics that can be used as part of preparing a body for the grave, wouldn't surprise me if these might be symbols and signs of the death of Jesus. What's even more clear, though, is that these are gifts that are gifts of wealth. They're gifts that are the kind of gifts you would give to someone who was a king. These are expensive gifts. When the wise men give these gifts to Mary, to Joseph, and to baby Jesus, what they are doing is recognizing that he is a king. Now, what's so interesting about this is that the gifts that the Magi give, they tap into a long line of tradition from the Hebrew Bible that said that one day the nations would come and they would bring their gifts to Jerusalem. Notice what, for example, Psalm 72 says. In this psalm, as it's praising the King of Israel, it says, "May the kings of Tarshish and the isles render him tribute. May the kings of Sheba and Seba bring gifts. May all kings fall down before him. All nations give him service." There's another passage, it's even more expressive here in the book of Isaiah. In this third part of Isaiah, we find the nation of Israel in a terrible state after the end of the exile. But here is the word that the prophet offers as encouragement to the people. "Arise, shine, for your light has come, and the glory of the Lord has risen upon you." Isaiah 60 verse 2, "The darkness shall cover the earth, and thick darkness the peoples, but the Lord will arise upon you, and his glory will appear over you. Nations shall come to your light, and kings to the brightness of your dawn. Lift up your eyes and look around. They all gather together. They come to you. Your sons shall come from far away. Your daughters shall be carried on their nurses' arms. Then you shall see and be radiant. Your heart shall thrill and rejoice, because the abundance of the sea shall be brought to you. The wealth of the nations shall come to you. A multitude of camels shall cover you. The young camels of Midian and Ephah, all those from Sheba shall come. They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall proclaim the praise of the Lord." I don't know about you, but I can hardly read this passage without hearing echoes of Matthew chapter 2. When it says earlier in verse 2, "The Lord will arise upon you, his glory will appear to you, nations shall come to your light." How can we not see in that these foreign magi, these foreign wise men as the representatives of the nations coming to your light? When it says that kings come to the brightness of your dawn, again, It sure sounds like that Matthew is tying back into this language here. And then, of course, at the end in verse 6, when it says, "They shall bring gold and frankincense, and shall proclaim the praise of the Lord." How could we not hear in this a foreshadowing of the Magi as they come, or at least in the Magi, the fulfillment of this notion that the nations will come? It's so interesting that the Magi recognized Jesus as a king, even though he came to earth in a most decidedly unkingly way. God chose to send his son to humanity not as a conquering hero, not as an Alexander the Great. God sent his son as a vulnerable baby. He was poor. He was dependent upon his mother and his father. He had to flee with them to Egypt because he was defenseless. He was a king. The Magi recognized him as a king, but he was the most uncommon sort of king. There is a lesson here in God's choosing to reach out to humanity in this most unusual way. Just as God had chosen the tiny nation of Israel to be his chosen people, not mighty Egypt, not mighty Babylon or Greece or Rome, just as Jesus chose a ragtag band of peasants to be his disciples. Not the priests who ran the temple, not the sages of his age and the interpreters of the law, just a band of peasants. Just as the first Christians would come from the common people, the outcast Gentiles, not from the kings and the rulers. In just this way, God has also reached out to us, ordinary people. Ordinary people who are too prone to stray. Ordinary people who come too late to recognize God's love for each one of us. As we read the Christmas story, the challenge for us is to follow the path of the Magi and not to follow the path of Herod. The task for us is to submit our positions, to submit our power to this humble Christ child, and to find in him the one true King. When we find that one true King, it will give us the strength to follow in that one true King's footsteps, to be people who embrace humility over pride, to be people who embrace care over conquest, to be people who reach out to those vulnerable around us by becoming vulnerable like they are. People who shape ourselves into those same kinds of people so that we can reach out to them with that same kind of Christ-like love. One of my favorite passages in all of the Bible is Philippians Chapter 2. It's this wonderful passage by Paul where he says that even though Christ existed in the form of God, he did not consider that godness to be something he had to clutch onto, but instead he emptied himself, took on the form of a servant, and became obedient even to the point of death. It was in that obedience, in that moment of his worst denigration, that Jesus also found his greatest exaltation. That moment that he describes in the book of John, it says, "And I, when I am lifted up, will draw all men to myself." What in the world did he mean by when he's lifted up? He was talking about his moment on the cross. His moment of greatest humiliation was also his moment of greatest exaltation. God has called us to follow in the footsteps of Jesus, most especially in this Advent season, to embrace the values of this Messiah who took on the form of a servant, who humbled himself to reach out to people who needed him. Let that be our spirit for this Advent season, as we bring to a close this most difficult year, when the temptation is to draw into ourselves and become literally self-centered, because we're supposed to distance ourselves from others, because we're supposed to think constantly about our own health and safety. Let our mantra in this time of year be one that we will humble ourselves and reach out in care and compassion to all of those people around us who need the love of Christ so much. I wish nothing but the blessings of the Christmas season upon all of you, and I look forward to the day when we will all join back together as one, and we will not be social distanced, but we will embrace one another with hugs and with rejoicing that we are finally able to see our friends and family once more. Merry Christmas to all of you.